welcome to the deep dive, where we kind of cut to the chase on like these really big ideas that matter and try to give you the information you need without, making it too complicated.
Right.
So you're probably interested in these fundamental questions we all have, but, like picking up a really heavy, dense book or, just feels like a huge commitment. Well, you're in the right spot because we did the heavy lifting for you.
That's right.
We dove into Arthur Schopenhauer's On Death and Pain. And yeah, I mean, this isn't just some, boring philosophy lecture or anything. It's surprisingly direct, even like raw.
Yeah.
When you look at the two things that are just unavoidable, right, for us as humans,
Yeah.
death and pain.
Yeah. And we navigated through all of Schopenhauer's insights on death and pain. And really, we're trying to bring you the most like powerful and thought-provoking things to kind of give you that express route to understanding his point of view on what it means to be human.
All right, so let's just jump right into death.
Yeah.
I mean, Schopenhauer hits us with the great disillusionment right off the bat. So what's at the core of that idea?
So the great disillusionment is really about how death reveals our temporary existence. He sees our being as this like fragile thing, and death is that final breaking point.
Yeah.
So really, you could say that painful annihilation we experience is like the fundamental flaw in our being.
Oh, wow. Okay, so he sees death not just as an end, but as like the ultimate reveal that our individual existence, is always this kind of fragile illusion.
Exactly.
Okay, and then he makes this really bold connection, I think, between like philosophy itself and death.
Right.
He calls death like the inspiring genius, the muse of philosophy. I mean, what's the reasoning there?
I mean, I think he argues that without, that stark reality of death staring us down, we wouldn't really even bother with philosophy, right? It's because we're aware that we're going to die that we ask those big why questions.
Oh, wow.
So you could say death is that primary motivator for searching for meaning.
So our awareness of, our limited time here is what sparks these big philosophical questions.
Yeah.
I like that. Okay. And then he contrasts he uses this phrase, the short dream of life, with the long night of eternity, which I think really, puts things in perspective.
Totally. It forces you to really think about the scale of it all.
Yeah.
He presents our lives as, short and fleeting, like a dream against that backdrop of this like eternal night.
Yeah.
Which really makes us question how important our brief time here actually is.
Right. And now someone might argue and say, well, okay, life is short, then you die, you become dust and ashes, like end of story. But Schopenhauer has a counter argument regarding like the persistence of matter. So what's his take on that?
Yeah, he anticipates that people are going to just be like, so what, we turn into dust.
Right.
But he wants us to really think about that dust.
Okay.
Because those atoms and molecules can turn into metal. They can turn into electricity, plants, animals. The things that we value so much are made up of those things.
Right.
So is that really nothing?
Yeah. I mean, it's a powerful point that, the basic components of who we are don't just vanish. They just rearrange.
Exactly.
And he uses nature as an example of this kind of persistence. He talks about insects preparing for winter or, metamorphosis and things like that.
Yeah, he's drawing parallels between death and sleep.
Okay.
He points to those insects getting ready for like hibernation or total transformation. They lay eggs to continue their line. And he argues that nature shows us that the difference between death and sleep isn't actually that fundamental because neither of them erase existence completely.
Right. Okay. And then he makes an analogy between, the insect preparing for its larva and a person like getting ready for bed before the next day.
Exactly.
And he's emphasizing, this sense of continuity.
Yeah. The way an insect like carefully prepares for its offspring is like us laying out our clothes or, planning for tomorrow. And it implies that the being that falls asleep or dies is still like connected to what comes after.
Right. And then he introduces the concept of life and death as, these balancing forces.
Yeah.
He even references Shiva, the Hindu deity. So what's the connection there?
So he sees birth and death as these two essential forces, right, that are always in balance. And he uses the image of Shiva, that god associated with destruction and creation to kind of represent that interconnectedness.
Okay.
And even love he sees as a kind of compensation for death. So it's like they neutralize each other.
Wow.
This big cosmic interplay.
And to further highlight, this contrast between like our own individual mortality and nature's vitality.
Right.
He brings up the practice by the Greeks and Romans of decorating sarcophagi with these scenes of vibrant life.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
They choose to adorn these final resting places with images of dances and hunts and celebrations. It's like juxtaposing human death with the energy of nature.
Right.
A reminder that life goes on even though we as individuals die.
Now, he introduces this kind of harsh idea, the necessity of death,
Mm-hmm.
where he argues that, like, the individual
Yeah.
has very little inherent value that's lost in death.
I mean,
That sounds pretty bleak.
it does sound bleak, yeah, but his argument is that while the individual, as this specific entity might not be super important, the core characteristics of humanity are indestructible.
Mm.
And he even suggested if we were granted eternal life, we'd eventually tired of our own unchanging character and limitless knowledge.
Wow.
So in a way, death becomes like a necessary escape.
So eternal life, as we are now, might actually become its own form of suffering.
Exactly.
And then he also touches on, like, a moral necessity of death.
Mm-hmm.
What does that entail?
So that comes from his idea that the real point of life is to be freed from this sense of like individual separation, right? And death does that. It like fundamentally makes you stop being a distinct, isolated being. And he says that being put in another world and completely changing who you are essentially the same. That individual consciousness with its petty and narrow concerns might actually find peace in that eternal rest.
He also brings in this concept of supremo consolo, which is the supreme consolation, talking about, like, the peaceful expressions on the faces of the dead.
It's interesting, right?
Yeah.
He sees it as proof that the end of all that striving and activity is actually a comfort to the life force. Like the struggle is over and there's peace.
And there's his take on nature's indifference to death, where he compares life and death to a game of dice.
Right.
Which is a pretty detached perspective.
It is. He portrays nature as this impartial observer, this game of chance where individuals are just born and die randomly.
Right.
And nature's just too big and impartial to care about any one being's fate.
And to illustrate this, he gives some stark examples of, like, vulnerable creatures facing constant danger that's just ignored.
Yeah.
Okay, and the analogy of the drying leaf, lamenting its fall, but not seeing, its connection to the tree is very poignant.
It is.
So what's the takeaway from that?
So the leaf, fixated on its own death, misses its connection to this larger life force of the tree. And Schopenhauer compares that to us, human generations. We fear being forgotten, but really we're all part of this continuous thing.
Okay, let's shift gears to that second major theme, pain.
Right.
Schopenhauer doesn't hold back at all. He starts with this bold statement, life is pain. So what's the basis for that?
So he thinks the desire is the root of all suffering, right? And since life is all about wanting things, it's inherently going to be painful.
Yeah.
And he even says, the smarter you are, the more you suffer.
Wow, so he thinks that, like, a truly pain-free life is just impossible?
It is, according to him, yeah.
Then he describes life as this losing battle, a cruel hunt. And he summarizes it all as this cycle of wanting, suffering, struggling without reason, dying quickly, and just repeating endlessly until the earth is destroyed. I mean, that is a grim outlook.
It's extremely pessimistic. He sees life as a struggle for survival where you're guaranteed to lose. And he says that it's like a horrible carnage where we're all predators and prey at different times.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's bleak.
So it's probably no surprise, then, that he's pretty critical of the idea of a, benevolent divine creator.
Right.
What are his issues with that idea?
He directly questions how a good God could allow so much suffering. And he suggests that if it was like an evil being who made us, we'd have every right to criticize them.
Right.
So it clashes with that traditional idea of a loving God.
He even argues that our hell surpasses Dante's Inferno because we can all be tormentors to each other.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought.
It is.
He's saying that the pain we inflict on each other in our everyday lives is worse than anything Dante could imagine. And he points to conquerors, those who start wars, as the ultimate source of suffering and death on a grand scale.
And he also criticizes this optimistic view that this is, the best of all possible worlds. What's his counter-argument to that?
He says, if anyone actually faced the reality of suffering, like in hospitals, prisons, battlefields, they wouldn't be so optimistic.
Right.
He thinks if you see the pain firsthand, you can't believe this is the best possible world.
He even says that our world is the perfect model for depicting hell.
Yeah, it's like he flips the script on Dante. Dante struggled to imagine paradise,
Right.
but hell was easy, and Schopenhauer says that's because our world is full of suffering.
He then brings up this idea of the tragic comedy of life, where our daily activities seem funny from a distance,
Right.
but our overall trajectory is tragic.
Yeah.
How does that play out?
It's like our routines and struggles can seem absurd when you zoom out,
Right.
but when you look at the big picture, the illusions, the
Yeah.
failures, the pain ending in death, it's all pretty tragic.
And he describes human life as oscillating between pain and boredom.
Yeah.
So why those two extremes?
So he argues that we're always swinging between pain, which is driven by our unfulfilled desires, and boredom, which comes when we get what we want, and then we're left with nothing.
Right.
He even jokes that after assigning torment to hell, people can only imagine heaven as boring.
He uses this analogy of like a dangerous sea voyage that inevitably ends in shipwreck to describe life.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that metaphor?
So he's saying life is like a journey with obstacles and dangers, all leading to the shipwreck of death. And he says that death is actually more dangerous than anything we try to avoid along the way.
And then he says all our attempts to escape pain just make it show up in different forms throughout our lives. It sounds like an inescapable cycle.
It is. He thinks it's pointless to try and eliminate pain.
Okay.
It disguises itself. So when you're young, it's basic needs. But then it becomes desire, envy, ambition, and eventually boredom.
He also has this thought about children being condemned not to death, but to life.
Yeah.
What does that mean in his philosophy?
So he's saying that kids are blissfully unaware of all the suffering that awaits them.
Right.
And from his point of view, the real punishment isn't death, it's living.
Wow.
Because life is inherently full of pain.
And he even argues that pain is the reason for our existence, not just like a random occurrence.
Yeah, he thinks if we didn't feel pain, our lives would have no purpose. He sees misfortune as the norm, not the exception.
Okay.
So pain is built in.
He describes life as this constant struggle, a war without quarter. That's a very adversarial way to look at it.
It is. He's saying we're always fighting against our own pain, our boredom, and the desires of other people.
Yeah.
It only ends when we die.
And even time itself, he says, is a torment. How so?
He sees time constantly pushing us forward as another source of suffering. It leads to a hurried and restless existence. And the only ones who are spared are those stuck in boredom.
Okay, but then he talks about the necessity of pain, again, this time for balance.
Right.
That seems contradictory.
Yeah, he's arguing that we need a certain amount of pain to keep things stable.
Okay.
He compares it to ballast in a ship, to keep it upright. Or atmospheric pressure keeping our bodies in shape.
Yeah.
So if all the pain suddenly vanished, we might become arrogant or delusional.
And he also questions what we would do with our time if all our desires were instantly granted, suggesting, boredom or even self-destruction.
Yeah, he's wondering what would happen if we lived in a world where everything was easy.
Right.
He thinks we'd probably get super bored or even do dangerous things to ourselves.
He even shares the sentiment of wishing for a barren, lifeless planet like the moon.
Yeah, when you think about all the suffering in the world, it makes sense that he'd want a world without life.
Yeah.
Because that would mean no pain.
And then he calls life the great lie, this pointless interruption of nothingness. That's a very bleak assessment.
It is. It's like he sees life as this meaningless break in the piece of non-existence, a giant trick.
He compares someone living through multiple generations to a bored circus spectator.
Right.
So what's the point of that analogy?
He's saying that just like a spectator gets bored of the same circus acts, someone who lives a long time sees the same human mistakes and illusions over and over.
Yeah.
And it just becomes tedious.
And he even finds the word defunctus, which means deceased, to be a very fitting term.
Yeah, he likes it because it describes this burdensome task we're forced to do until we finally want rest, which is death.
His description of the world as a vast inferno populated by victims and tormentors is very disturbing.
It is. It's a very dark view.
It is.
He sees existence as this constant suffering where we cause pain and we receive it.
Then he addresses the people who might say his philosophy is depressing, and he basically says he's just speaking the truth.
Yeah, he defends himself by saying he's being honest about life, even if it's not pleasant. And he contrasts that with all the optimistic views that he thinks are just denying reality. And he sees the philosopher's role as questioning, not just accepting comforting lies.
He even wonders if humanity would continue if having children was based on logic and not instinct.
Right.
which is a pretty big ethical question.
It is. He's basically saying that if we really thought about the suffering in life,
Right.
we might not choose to bring more people into it.
And he says, no one is truly worthy of envy, while many deserve compassion.
Yeah, that comes from his idea that everyone suffers.
Right.
So envy doesn't make sense because we don't know what others are going through, but compassion is always appropriate.
And he even extends this pessimism to the cosmos, saying that other planets might also be filled with tears, pain, or boredom.
Yeah, his pessimism is universal.
Yeah.
He looks at our world and assumes other planets are the same.
Okay, he then explores the idea of the world as a place of expiation.
Yeah.
What's his take on those kinds of views?
So he looks at different perspectives that see the world as like arising from a mistake or some kind of flaw. And he contrasts that with this idea that a good God made a world full of pain for his own pleasure.
Right.
And he finds those expiation theories more believable.
Okay. And then he criticizes theodicy, which is the attempt to justify God's goodness in the face of evil.
Right.
What's his argument there?
So even if you say this is the best possible world, he argues that God is still responsible for the possibility of suffering.
Right.
And so he could have made a better world. So pain itself disproves the idea of a perfect creation.
And he points to our imperfections as humans as further evidence.
Yeah, he sees us, with all our flaws, our vulnerabilities, and our capacity for pain as kind of a joke.
Yeah.
Like the perfect design.
He then considers the idea that the world's suffering is our own fault because of, original sin.
Right.
How does that concept fit into his philosophy?
So it's a way to explain suffering without blaming a loving God.
Oh.
He's saying that maybe we're the problem, not God.
He suggests that we should view the world as a vale of tears or a penal colony.
Yeah.
What does that shift in perspective offer?
He thinks those descriptions, a place of suffering or a place of punishment, are more accurate than seeing it as a place of pleasure.
Right.
Because that's the reality of human experience.
And he even compares society at large to a prison.
Yeah, he says just like a prisoner is tormented by being around other criminals,
Right.
sensitive people might feel the same way about being around other people.
He even proposes we start greeting each other as fellow sufferer. What's the benefit of that?
So he thinks if we acknowledged our shared experience of suffering, it would make us more empathetic and understanding.
Then he makes this point that pain is actually the only positive sensation,
Right.
while well-being is just the absence of pain, which is very counterintuitive.
He uses this analogy of a river, flowing smoothly versus hitting rocks.
Yeah.
We only really notice when something's wrong. So pain, which is that resistance is what we feel. Well, well-being is just the lack of resistance.
And he argues that happiness is actually negative because it involves getting rid of desire or ending pain.
Yeah, he says happiness isn't its own thing. It's just the stopping of something bad, like a desire being fulfilled or a pain going away.
Okay. And
he points out that joy never really lives up to our hopes, but pain always exceeds our fears.
Then he uses a pretty stark example of a predator eating its prey to highlight that difference between pleasure and pain.
Yeah, it's a brutal contrast.
Yeah.
The predator gets a quick burst of pleasure, but it's based on the long, drawn-out pain of the prey.
Right.
So it shows how much of what we think of as good is actually rooted in something bad.
He compares human life to these, fragile, short-lived soap bubbles. What's he getting at with that image?
Even though we know our lives are temporary, like soap bubbles that will burst, we still put so much effort into them.
Right.
It's strange, right?
It is.
We're so attached to something so fleeting.
And he says that true happiness can't exist in the present moment.
Yeah.
So where does he think it exists?
He sees life as this trick where we're always chasing happiness, but it's either not here yet or it's already gone.
Right.
So real happiness is always in the future or in the past.
Okay.
And the present is just this fleeting moment of pain or the potential for pain.
And he portrays life not as this good we should enjoy, but as this task we have to perform through constant struggle.
Yeah, he emphasizes the constant effort we need just to survive,
Right.
which leads to competition and never-ending striving.
And he even questions, what's the point of all this effort?
Exactly. He's asking what's the meaning behind it all.
Right.
And he suggests that maybe it's just to keep us alive long enough to suffer.
And to repeat the cycle.
Exactly.
And he calls humans the most needy and defenseless beings.
Yeah.
What's he highlighting there?
Our weaknesses.
Yeah.
We have all these desires and needs, and we're constantly surrounded by danger.
He says that once we've got our basic needs met, we then focus on killing time to avoid boredom.
Right.
What's the implication of that?
So he's saying that once we're safe and fed, our next goal is to distract ourselves from how empty life feels.
Yeah.
Even though trying to escape boredom just makes life go by faster.
And he connects boredom to the social instinct.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting link.
It is. He thinks boredom drives us to be around other people.
Okay.
Even if we don't actually like them that much. And he uses the example of prisoners who kill themselves to escape boredom.
Wow.
It shows how powerful that need for distraction can be.
He repeats the idea that we only truly feel pain and those negative states, not their absence.
Yeah, he's emphasizing that pleasure and satisfaction aren't real feelings.
Right.
We only become aware of things when something's wrong, when we're in pain or scared or want something.
And he says we only appreciate good things like health or freedom when we lose them.
Exactly, because they're really just the absence of something bad.
And he also points out how our perception of time changes based on whether we're feeling pain or pleasure.
Right. Time feels slow when we're sad because pain demands our attention. But when we're happy, time flies because there's nothing bothering us.
Yeah, and he says that the greatest joys are only felt after great pain. And that lasting peace and happiness is impossible.
Yeah. He thinks we can only appreciate joy after experiencing suffering.
Okay.
And that a truly happy life just isn't in the cards.
He even quotes Voltaire, who said, happiness is only a dream and pain is real. That really summarizes Schopenhauer's view.
It does.
Yeah.
Voltaire's words perfectly capture Schopenhauer's belief in the reality of suffering and the illusion of happiness.
Schopenhauer describes most lives as having this, superficial meaninglessness and inner gloom.
Right.
And he calls that the eternal refrain.
Yeah, he paints this picture of lives filled with routine, unfulfilled desires and emptiness.
Right.
Like a broken record playing the same sad song over and over.
He says that each of us is like a fleeting dream created by the will to live, destined to disappear and be replaced, but only after a lot of pain and eventually death.
Yeah, it's a pretty fatalistic view.
Yeah.
He's saying our lives are temporary and tragic. We're just manifestations of this bigger force that wants to keep existing.
Right.
And it all comes at the cost of suffering.
And finally, he presents this really stark view of the world as like a battlefield and a theater of cruelty.
Yeah, he sees the world as brutal, where everything survives by eating something else. And the more intelligent you are, the more you suffer.
Right.
And humans are at the top of that pyramid.
Right.
So he dismisses any optimistic views as just necessary illusions.
Wow. Well, that was an intense journey through Schopenhauer's ideas about death and pain.
It was, yeah.
Definitely a lot to think about.
There is, as we've seen, Schopenhauer is consistently pessimistic.
Right.
We've talked about his ideas on death being a potential escape and the source of philosophy, and his thoughts on suffering being unavoidable, happiness being fleeting, and pain being everywhere.
Absolutely. So for you, the listener, having gone through Schopenhauer's worldview, how does this change the way you think about your own pursuit of happiness?
Right.
Or your acceptance of death?
I mean, it definitely gives you a new lens to view your own life.
It does. And, as we said at the beginning, this is just an introduction to Schopenhauer's thought. His work is full of these challenging ideas.
It is.
So we encourage you to explore more of his writings.
Yeah.
Or, other philosophers who deal with these same questions, if you're interested.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.